Good afternoon. We are going to start the white paper session now. We are going to draw our inspiration from Tame. He couldn't be with us this afternoon because he had to leave to be with his wife. So what we're going to do is really draw upon some of the ideas that he shared with us and he inspired us with, and generate some conversations about the concepts of what does it mean to decolonize ourselves and what does it mean to indigenize the university. So maybe as we start, we begin by discussing some of the ideas that Tame shared with us. And one of these ideas that seem to emerge across the conversations we've had over the last week is the idea of space, and the concept that how do we build space that is decolonizing, and what is the relationship between that decolonized space and the space within the university. So in our conversations that Steve and I had with Tame, he talked about this idea of moving that space of learning and of knowledge generation into the Marae, recognizing the sovereignty of the Marae as a space for knowledge generation, with the idea that decolonized knowledge itself is generated in community by people in the community and owned by them. In that sense, then, the role of the university also is transformed in terms of thinking through how the university exists within the context of the decolonization project. One of the key ideas there then becomes that the university simply just doesn't look at decolonization as another tick mark, checking out some boxes and then saying that, okay, now we have decolonized because we have fulfilled these boxes, and still retaining power within the colonial structures of the university, but rather to actually start thinking through how to deconstruct the very structures of the university to make these structures porous, and in that process actually support the knowledge generation and the learning capacities of communities within the context of their decolonial struggle. So the challenge here is powerful because it suggests that the very idea of the university needs to be decolonized, particularly thinking through the ways in which universities measure, reward, and structure processes of learning, processes of research, and processes of engagement, where the power still is very much held within the colonial structures of the university. So then I guess, what I take away from that is what does that mean for learning to belong to the Marae, for the ownership of that learning process to happen in the Marae, and for the university to be in a supportive role, in a capacity supporting role in that transformative journey. So maybe I will throw that question to our audience and hear some thoughts from them in terms of how do you imagine this movement, from the university being a structure that simply does outreach as a way to reach out, and that becomes decolonization, to completely transforming it to communities owning the sites and spaces of knowledge generation. Can we give the microphone to our audience, please?
Kia ora, Mohan. I guess I'd like to know, what does it look like? I mean, I can see the concept that he explained with the marae and the university. And not only what does it look like, but the practicalities of that, given the the dominance of the university system, how it's actually structured. And I think it would mean the university needs to relinquish some power. And how would that happen? How do you foresee that happening?
I think that's a really good question. I don't think universities as colonial structures would automatically give up power in order to decolonize. So I think the work then is for us as academics, as students, and activists within the universities in terms of starting to deconstruct some of these sources of power. And that, in terms of how it works, then you're asking a very practical question in terms of what it means for how we live our lives. And I think part of that challenge is sort of starting to question our metrics, how we measure research in the university. It is about how we measure our teaching in the university. And it is about questioning how we measure engagement in terms of our work in the university. But more importantly, it is also about questioning university bureaucracies. That's how I would think about the inspiration that Tame offers us, because these bureaucracies are incredibly colonial. So, from that ethic, what I learned is that perhaps we ought to be suspicious when universities say that we want to decolonize, or when universities want to say within the power structures that we want to now create decolonizing bodies of knowledge. Because the moment that gets co-opted within the structures, then you have new set of metrics, new sets of formulas of measurement that again take away power from communities as spaces of knowledge generation. So I think part of that is just questioning the very bureaucracies and the processes of measurement, evaluation, and implementation that get configured in how universities are run in day-to-day forms. So what do you think of that?
I'm interested in your concept of community as a place of knowledge production, and what Tame was talking about, going back to the marae to learn as opposed to going to the university to learn, and how that could work with a university setting. So whether or not that somehow in some way knowledge could be, rather than being gained through university lecturers, perhaps going back to the marae and getting it through elders instead of through traditional lecturing practices.
Yeah. So that also shifts who is sharing that knowledge, who is sharing that wisdom. In many ways. So, I mean, what was exciting is that when we think about Tame as a teacher, and you see the amount of audience he drew in, all the way from the schools where he went to share his wisdom, to our classrooms that were filled to capacity to learn from his wisdom. That basically, I see that itself as decolonizing, because that challenges the very idea of who produces knowledge, who is the legitimate producer of knowledge, who should be the one that is producing knowledge. And I think, Phoebe, I get your point in terms of that itself being transformative, because as opposed to the university doing engagement, where the university still extracts knowledge from the community through engagement to then perpetuate its own political economy of colonization, this fundamentally shifts the very economics of knowledge generation, where communities own the knowledge that they generate and are respected for the knowledge they generate. Did you want to add anything to the conversation? Welcome.
Picking up on your point about the audience size, I thought it was quite fascinating that someone could come in without any university qualifications or education and just be able to engage in a university setting with that amount of people, just like a lecturer at the front of the hall, and do it in a way which is kind of, like what we used to really in a university environment, with an excellent lecturer or professor at the front, without qualifications though. And I'm wondering whether that means there's space to reimagine what the university could actually look like. Because that's unheard of, having someone like that without a PhD or master's standing there and actually delivering something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a beautiful idea, and that's where I would like to go with Tame's notion of the marae being a space of knowledge generation. Certainly, we have seen that in a lot of the work of care, where communities are the owners of knowledge. So, say women farmers who own indigenous knowledge of the seeds, like growing millets and sustainable farming, and actually become the sources of wisdom, become the teachers that we could go to learn from. Now, this concept is also really interesting because it has to work in a way that challenges again the role of university as an extractive institution, and I think that is part of the decolonization process, is to reimagine the nature of university as it exists now. Because in a lot of the way in which we go about the business of engagement is we go to communities, we script the knowledge that is produced in the communities, we gather it, and then we privatize it, commoditize it, and circulate it in networks of capital to benefit the university and to benefit us as participants in the political economy of the university. So what you're suggesting, Steve, is really decolonization in terms of fundamentally asking about what it means to produce knowledge. So that the decolonization process is not about, helping me build my CV further, so that now I am an expert on how to decolonize, so that, like Tame was saying, so that children from the marae can come to the university now to learn to decolonize, but rather to disrupt the very idea of university with the idea that knowledge actually exists in the marae in terms of the processes of decolonization and the habits of decolonization, and perhaps we need to learn from there. Now, having said that, I think it's the practical modality of that is the key here, because colonization as a habit, it works to co-opt. It has this incredible capacity to co-opt and to incorporate decolonizing voices within the structures of colonization. So that often then when we carry out the decolonizing work in the university, it actually becomes a matter of us following the same metrics that are set up by the university to pretty much participate in the same colonial habits and logics rather than decenter those. What do you think of that?
Agreed.
This is a little bit removed, but you're talking about care projects overseas, and I'm just thinking internationally, have there been similar cases that we could draw from talking about decolonisation in a university setting?
Yeah, I think that's been happening a great deal, particularly with movements of indigenous peoples across the global south. I mean, with the question of who produces the knowledge, who owns the knowledge, where is knowledge shared, where is wisdom shared, and how does knowledge flow? I think these kinds of questions are being asked across the global south, whether it is in South Asia, whether it is in Latin America, whether it is in Africa, with the question of who owns knowledge and what purpose will knowledge serve. But I think the struggle of it is to maintain that space that is decolonizing, with ideas such as activists and community organizers, people like Tame, become the sources of knowledge rather than universities become the sources of writing up what Tame would say and then making a whole profitable enterprise out of it, So I think that is an ongoing struggle because increasingly universities are corporatized, are privatized, and as a result of that, what you would find is that decolonization is just one of the things that the university does to speak to a particular market segment. And at the same time, it participates in a variety of colonial projects to speak to another market segment. So universities in that sense have become increasingly market-driven organizations where decolonization itself too has become a market for publications, a market for grants, and a market for students to be produced in a particular way.
On that, it's kind of like more of a comment than a question. Last Friday's terrorist attacks, those working in the anti-racism space, anti-white supremacy space in Aotearoa, there are very, very few, and I know your centre, our Centre Care Centre, has been dedicated to anti-racism, and now suddenly we're seeing I don't know how you can say it, I guess a huge number of opinion pieces, and even on social media you're seeing other academics who are usually silent, and generally they are the Pākehā academics speaking up and talking as experts of anti-racism and white supremacy. I didn't see them last year or the year before or ever talking about this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, it's great that you connect the conversation on racism and anti-racist interventions to the broader question of decolonization. So you're right. I agree. On one hand, it is great to have many voices at this point talking about how to address racisms that are prevalent in our societies. On the other hand, I think it is also important to be cognizant that there is a certain element of market responsiveness to the ebb and flow of topics. Yeah, so to actually do anti-racist work requires significant and sustainable commitment, especially at times when you do not have the unfortunate events of last Friday. And what you would often see happens during those times is that you're branded as a troublemaker if you talk about racism, because everyone wants to believe that, we are an equal society where love flourishes and there is no racism. So to talk about it is to make trouble, is to be inconvenient. So one thing I would say is that this kind of episodic response to racism, where we are all starting to wear hijabs, for instance. On one hand, it's okay because it's an expression of public sentiment. On the other hand, it is episodic, and that's that. There is nothing systematic about it. While racism, as we know from our lived experiences, colonialism, these are deeply rooted and often supported and perpetuated by structures, including structures of universities. As I was saying in Tame's introduction, that the cellular structures of universities are often deeply racist, are fundamentally racist in terms of how, say, funding cycles work, how donors work, how politicians exert their influence, and often in invisible and opaque ways. So, say, for instance, in a regular setting, right, you have someone like Tame, who disrupts the colonial structures to come into the space of the university. It would be perceived or might be labeled as threatening to the structure of the university. Now, when you ask, what is threatening about Tame speaking in the university? And it would, to answer that question, you would have to look at the cellular structure of the university and what is considered to be normative within the cellular structure of the university. and what is normative are the expectations of whiteness and white civility that keep colonialism intact and that perpetuate colonialism at the same time. So that is why an authentic decolonizing conversation would be threatening to the normative structures of a university in its everyday life. So in some ways, this is something I think of myself in terms of the work of CARE, but also in terms of the work of anti-racist interventions. That perhaps, one measure of whether you're transforming the structures or not is to look at whether you're making structures uncomfortable. That's a very good metric, because to the extent that structures are comfortable, you can be fairly certain that you're being co-opted into particular narratives of the structure where it sees that it can co-opt your voice. So the decolonized voice, of course, is welcome to the extent that it supports the multicultural narrative of the structure. But the moment it becomes threatening, or the moment it becomes challenging, and those are usually the decolonizing voices of activists, the decolonizing voices that challenge the fundamental granularity of those structures, then those are silenced. And how are they silenced? They're often silenced using the norms of civility. They're often silenced by making calls to dialogue. So in my work, I've often argued that the call to dialogue itself often is colonizing and often perpetuates racism and racist formations, because we use the appeal to dialogue or the appearance of dialogue to prevent any conversations on racism. So if you are talking about, for instance, existing racism within university structures in New Zealand, you would be considered to be uncivil, impolite, improper to the norms of the structure. So when I say that conversations and dialogue are often colonial, what I mean by that is the rules of the game are often written by the colonizer. So what it means to participate in the dialogue, how do you participate in the dialogue, who participates in the dialogue, what can you or you cannot talk about. These are all established by the colonizers. So in that sense, our ability to sit at the table, like we talk about the table as a space where we can have that conversation, right? So our ability to sit at the table is often tied to our ability to speak the language of the colonizer and to let ourselves be co-opted. So in that sense, then think about it, Steve, going back to your question, to decolonize then is to also decolonize how we talk about racism, so that racism itself doesn't become a faddish entity to engage with when it is convenient for us, but the conversation on racism is something that is grounded in the voices of colonized peoples, in the voices of migrants, in the voices of Muslims who experience racisms and bring out conversations that are inconvenient, who draw attention to the ways in which our structures work, so that we cannot get moving by saying, this is not us. We are about love. But rather we begin by saying, okay, you know what, we are formed on a colonial history. What is the basis of this colonial history? Of course it is hatred. Of course it is violence. Of course it is racism. Let's have those inconvenient conversations, and most importantly, create spaces for those. What do you think of that?
Again, I agree 100%. And while you're talking about that, I remember with Tame talking about decolonising ourselves as well. And going back to yesterday's workshop, there were a lot of Māori academics there, and I started thinking about us as Māori academics. How do we decolonise ourselves? Because we have come into this system, this education system, which is a colonial system. We've gone through Most of us have gone through the system to, have PhDs, and I'm feeling that while we think, we are Māori, of course, but while our thinking is Māori, I'm starting to feel that a big part of our thinking and how we engage with the university, with our students, has actually been colonised. And we are part of the system, and we are actually repeating like a cycle. So we're actually no different to the mainstream, to the coloniser. What are your thoughts on that?
Can I ask you something? Can you tell me why you feel that? Can you give me some examples to elucidate that?
Well, for example, yesterday, one of the other staff, Māori staff academics there, mentioned that in order for him to be a successful academic, he had to leave a lot of himself at the door. So he couldn't be Māori completely in the university and to get to the level where he is now. Is that a good example?
Yeah,
No?
yeah. I can't imagine I can, but I can't imagine the violence of that, right? I say I can because, being very much product of colonizing system, created by the British Empire, and colonized in the tongue of the empire, in the way in which I speak. In some ways, I don't even know what does it mean to go back to indigenous knowledge in some ways, except that which is offered to me from within the structure. So I understand that. And I guess, the question then with that is, if we were to challenge the structures of the university by inhabiting the space, and I'm reminded of the public talk that Tame offered, and one of our colleagues was saying that she finds it hard to work within the university system, because every time that she tries to have a voice, it is shut down, it is silenced. So then, what is the way forward, especially when attempts at authentic decolonization in that sense will sort of meet with that kind of response?
Yeah, I think there isn't enough of us speaking up or speaking at all, except, in conferences and in, I guess you'd call, safe spaces. But generally speaking, we don't have a Ranginui Walker anymore. We don't have people like that. We have some people, but not enough giving voice and, articulating. I'm talking about Māori people, Māori academics. And I'm not sure, well, I guess for most Māori academics, they probably are reluctant or hesitant to do that because of the backlash from within and without. From within the university, you could face it, but also news media coverage of anything you say anti-racism or whatever is going to be immediately attacked in the comments or on social media, or you'll get emails and that kind of thing, as you know. So I don't know, how do we manage this? How do we enable more Māori academics to put their voices out there?
I think, for one is, for decolonized struggles, whether it is Maori struggles or whether it is struggles in Latin America, South Asia, or Africa, or in Palestine, it's important for these struggles to be connected with each other and to find solidarity in that sense. So I think, in many ways, perhaps the way to walk through this challenge is with solidarity, because, the way in which the market-based, bureaucratized university works is by individualizing us. So that, I mean, and you see this happen again and again, that when an academic is picked up by the colonial structure for having violated it or for having interrogated it. And I mean, I give the example of Professor Marc Lamontel at Temple recently, who was picked up and intensely attacked for his comments on the Israeli occupation of Palestine. One thing you often see is that solidarity is hard to come by. Now, there are certain instances, like with his instance, there are many academics that immediately jumped in to say that this is unacceptable. He has the right to critique the colonial occupation of Palestine by Israel. But I think that kind of solidarity, where we stand by each other, where we protect each other, where we lend our bodies and voices to each other, is sort of the basic entry point. So if universities as individualizing, marketizing, privatizing, commoditizing structures turn us into individuals measuring our risks and benefits and unable to connect with each other, the way we challenge that in decolonization is precisely by collectivizing, by finding each other, and by standing with each other. I also think then part of that journey of solidarity is to actually see how we make spaces for voices that are unheard. So when Tame invites us to decolonize ourselves, what that makes me reflect upon is my privilege. I appear brown. I come from a colonized context where sort of we have a history of a long decolonization struggle, but also the ways in which my privilege erases, obfuscates, silences voice. And I think that, so when you see decolonizing ourselves as that kind of continual interrogation of our own privilege, that perhaps opens us up to really thinking through this question: how do we make spaces for voices that are being unheard, and particularly voices that are uncomfortable? So in my own work, for instance, when I ask, how do we make spaces for voices of the Palestinian people today as they are challenging settler colonialism and its violent effects? You see that in Gaza in terms of the kinds of violence that is taking place. I think that then leads to a really interesting question: how do we lend our decolonizing bodies not just to writing the next journal article or the next keynote conversation at a conference, but to really thinking through how do we transform this space so that Palestinians can have a voice in their decolonizing struggles. So in that sense also, Steve, I think what is beautiful is how these decolonizing struggles are connected. And that's also the part of the solidarity, which is that going to the marae to connect with the world, meaning that to the decolonizing that happens at the level of the community, also perhaps being a basis for developing a wider lens of universality that connects with the decolonizing struggles of people across the globe. So that again, there is more power to that kind of unity that emerges, Did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I'm not good in public speaking. So.
That's okay. Does this resonate, what we are talking about?
Yes, exactly, yeah. Well, I think we should use the indigenous people knowledge as much as possible because they are much longer on our Mother Earth than, the white people. And I think they are, and they were more successful than us. So, yeah, I think maybe now it's time and opportunity to start from the source and roots and the beginnings.
That's a beautiful point. Like start from the beginning,
Yeah.
right? And a large part of that is undoing sort of how we are scripted into learning in specific ways, you know. Um, uh, One of the questions that, you know, again, Tame invited us to think about is that what are the challenges to decolonized voices? So, why is it that we cannot hear decolonized voices at this moment, even as we recognize how important it is for us to decolonize, for the earth, for instance, to sustain itself? Yeah. And yet, just like you're saying, that for us to go to that beginning, we have to make spaces for those voices. We have to learn as universities to be comfortable with the Tamites inhabiting these spaces, right? But how do we do that when you have existing structures that would respond to this by saying that, oh, this is too uncomfortable, this is disruptive, this doesn't fit into our codes of civility? So I think our struggle is to make, as academics, particularly I see, you know, my role as an academic with privilege as a struggle of how do you make spaces for these voices on an ongoing and continual way, and how do you make space for dialogue with the recognition that dialogue cannot be superficial. Yeah, dialogue cannot be about, how much we love each other, without really talking about, let's make the space first to think through how hate operates, how racism operates, and how that has worked to silence many voices, you know. So, you know, one of the questions that I also wanted to ask you within this overarching framework then is the question of specific steps. So we talked about solidarity, for instance, but what are some of the specific steps that we can take so we can move to the marae, or we can make space for the marae to be the site of knowledge generation without being co-opted through our interactions with the marae?
Does it start with bringing people like Tame into the university, giving them that space? I also wonder if the large number of people that came to Tame's talk possibly shows that there's a need for this, and people wanting to have these discussions and wanting to change the university. So I guess the first step I think is possibly bringing people in from the community into the university space.
And that would, in many ways, fundamentally change the nature of the university space, right? What that space looks like, what is the feel, the sound, the smell, like Tame was saying, of that space, right? And again, that would mean that we transform ourselves from people that extract as academics, because that's how we have been trained, to people that listen, that attend to that which has been erased, and are always cognizant of how to make space for those voices.
Yeah, I mean, the number of people who have said and commented online and in person about having Tame in the university, how he should be here more often, or can we take him to Albany campus, and can he do a series? You know, I think there is definitely a demand there for his voice and voices like him to be in this space. My only concern, though, is if the university co-opts that, you know, and sees the financial gain of student numbers and bums on seats. That would be my only concern, but I think it would be something. And if Massey was able to do that first, well, yeah.
You know, one of the things, Steve, that you and I talked about within this context was, the number of visits Tame made during his trip to schools.
Yes.
Schools with predominantly Maori children, but also schools with predominantly underserved Maori children who otherwise wouldn't have access to pathways of mainstream instrumental market-based education. And there I thought, again, there was something powerful about learning and pathways and mobility, because it appears that there is a challenge to, say, a voice like Tame's being co-opted into the university structure, where then that becomes another enclosure and then gets taken away from the community spaces where those voices are needed. Because in the traditional structure, for many of those students in the schools, they wouldn't have access to the pathway of the university simply because of the colonizing processes that are built up. So I think another challenge that corresponds with this then is, how do you resist and transform this tendency to enclose? Because it doesn't look like the kinds of opportunities of learning and transformation that are brought up by opening up and going into communities as open spaces actually work when you think about formulating those within structures of universities. Because the moment you do that, you have closed off. It becomes part of a curriculum that students will have to pay the university fees in order to come in and follow, and therefore they have to take fit certain criteria, and often criteria of economic mobility, in order to be able to access,
Yes.
Professor, we've got a comment from Facebook for Belinda Baxter. Said to follow this page, it's a great insight. We're seeing a lot more sort of activity with the activists coming in on social media, and is that something that is solely for CARE to be providing, or is the university on I guess, a wider sort of spectrum?
I mean, it's an incredible thing that we have had the opportunity of engaging with people and with communities, not just here in New Zealand, but across various parts of the globe. I think, one of the things in terms of just thinking about CARE and why we do what we do is the idea of democratizing spaces for voices, right? So in that sense itself, I think it is incredible to see communities participate in these spaces and for this to be open-ended, right? So moving away, I think part of the decolonization then is to resist enclosure, because that is the colonizer's way. That is how the Pakeha came into communities to carry out colonialism, right? I mean, this is true of much of South Asia as well. People didn't know about enclosures, privatization, how to transact in those narrow kind of commoditized ways. When those techniques therefore were brought in and large amounts of lands were usurped to enclosed, people didn't have the language to engage with that or to challenge that. So I think part of the decolonizing work then is to resist that kind of grab, whether it is land grab and land acquisition or knowledge acquisition, all kinds of movements of enclosure. And then that goes all the way from enclosing knowledge to enclosing movements of climate change, to enclosing parts of the environment and nature, where water, air, mountains, forests, these are all spaces that are being colonized across the globe, right? And I think I go back to your point, what can we learn from first peoples of the world? And that is that how can you actually exist in ways and in livelihoods that can work without enclosing, without usurping, without taking over,
Going back to kind of related to the question just asked off Facebook, I think it is important for everyone to know that this event was promoted specifically by the Care Centre and still is. For example, the people at Massey newsletter that went out through the email yesterday didn't have any coverage of the events this week, even though we picked out 2 lecture halls. Well, not we, even though Tamaiti picked out 2 lecture halls, and that we didn't receive any promotion leading up to the events, nothing on the Massey website or anything like that. I'm not slagging Massey, I'm just saying that I mean the opportunity was there for the university to get behind it. For whatever reason, I'm not going to speculate, but for whatever reason it was driven specifically by CARE. But I will say that CARE is open to working with everyone. Mohan's opened the door up to academics across Massey and to, well, even other universities in New Zealand and overseas. This is a collaborative centre, and so anyone who's watching this on Facebook now or later on, if they want to get in touch with you, Mohan, they can contact you, right?
Or with you or with any of us, absolutely. And I think, part of this then is to also recognize what this journey is going to look like as we decolonize more spaces and make them open for different voices, right, Steve? And again, how do we democratize the opportunities for voice? That's what it comes down to at the end. And I think, I'm going to throw this question back to you as our audience, that I found Tame's talk to be healing, and his presence here on this campus at this point of time to be healing, because of the kinds of ideas he was talking about openness, about invitation, about dialogue and possibilities of decolonization. So then I guess, the question is, because the interest in talking about marking, categorizing racism and addressing it is going to peak and then it's going to be gone, right? And pretty soon again, just like how cycles operate, it will be inconvenient to talk about racism. Racism will be too disruptive. It will be seen as non-dialogic or extremist to talk about racism. So then the question for us doing the decolonization work, I think, is how do we sustain these spaces for conversations on racism and carrying out and developing anti-racist interventions across our spaces, So do you all have any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, this series has been going on since you got here, a monthly activist in residence, and it's been focused on anti-racism. That's the theme. Anti-racism is the theme of the series. So I think we just need to continue doing that. We were doing that before last Friday, been doing that since you got here when you arrived with the centre last year, and we just need to keep working away.
Yeah, I think with the having Tame here is we've connected with a lot more people that can see what we're doing, and so hopefully we can keep conversations with them going and keep them on board with what we work with as we move forward. So yeah, I think working with other people, you can see from social media we've got a lot of people watching what's going on and just keeping them on board.
Yeah. Did you have any thoughts? How can we sustain ourselves?
No, just keeping what you are doing, and try to find valuable, full of wisdom and wise people, and invite them and do exactly what you did with Tamaiti.
And also through, of course, disseminating research and getting it out there, findings, what's going on in the community and what needs to be changed.
Yeah, I think with Tame's visit this week, it was definitely successful if we're using, metrics across the board, number of people in the audience. No, not today, but I mean, the other days.
Yes.
And I mean, I had a look 2 days ago, or was it yesterday, at the a video that Te Karere had put on their Facebook, where Tame had visited the Highbury Whānau Centre here as part of his residency and had 19,000 views then So his visit has definitely, been impactful.
Great. Thanks for this conversation. I'm just going to spend the next 3 or 4 minutes wrapping up some of the ideas that we discussed, inspired by Tame. So he offered us a challenge. What does it mean to decolonize knowledge by taking it to the marae, where the concept of sovereignty becomes the basis for how knowledge is organized. So this is a challenge I think we all have to work with, and this is sort of the white paper that will finally emerge as we continue to converse with Tame about what does it mean for the knowledge to move to the community and for communities to own these spaces of knowledge, with the university, our research, our pedagogy, our infrastructures being in supportive roles. We also talked about this question of decolonial solidarity, that we cannot do this alone. CARE certainly cannot do this alone. None of us as academics can do this alone. This has to be our collective project as we come together and find spaces, like you're saying, for different voices to work together. In this sense, I think a key concept of the culture-centered approach, which is to build infrastructures for voices of the margins, is an important thread. The voice of the subaltern that has historically been erased. How do we make space for that voice, or those voices of the subaltern, hopefully is a question that stays with us in all our conversations. And finally, I think that to recognize that the colonization project or the colonial project is far from over. All the way from settler colonies to existing and new forms of colonization of water, how water is being privatized across the globe, to forms of colonization of the earth, in terms of new extractive projects that are being carried out and implemented. Decolonization is a relevant and important call of our times. So I think, the learning from Tame that I hope that we can take forward is how do we bring the knowledge to the marae and at the same time challenge the colonizing forces, especially the colonizing forces that we all inhabit within structures of universities and within dominant frameworks. So thank you for participating in this conversation. We want to thank Tame again for this incredible week. Thanks to you, our audience, for your ongoing engagement with us. Thanks to Massey for the support. And thank you, Steve, for really introducing us to the work of Tame and for introducing this bridge to hopefully thinking in new ways about the decolonization project.